And that's it. We're live. We're broadcasting. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I did, Friday the 13th was yesterday. Did the horror thing a little. And with today, I'll probably I'm gonna probably be hit the sack right after the show tonight, but I kind of want to see if I can force myself to stay awake and watch Saturday the 14th with my girlfriend, because it's a terrible comedy, but it's got to keep the themes going, right?
I've heard of it, but I've never actually seen it.
it it's everybody should see it once. I think that's a fair assessment for it.
Fair enough. Maybe I'll check it out sometime.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely. I mean, I like it. It's a good title, obviously. How do you nail a premise that has become synonymous with another the phobia of Friday the 13th, and also the reputation of the film franchise, right? So how do you live up to that? And it's a hard, it's a hard thing to do. But I'm glad to have you here, back again for another exciting episode.
I feel like this probably is my sixth time, I think.
Yes, that would be correct.
Last time I was the five-timer, but now it's the six-timer, which is it's a big deal, I think.
I think so. I think that's a fair assessment. 100%. Yeah. It's we got six. I mean, we're getting close to the end of the year. We've definitely crossed the halfway point of the scripts to discuss, and still more to go, and a whole nother batch due in just 2 months ish, maybe a little longer, but not by much. So it's a good we're in a good place. I think we're in a pretty good place, and
Yeah,
I'm glad to
it's a
have you
good
back.
show. I'm glad to be here. It's a good show. I always enjoy being here, and I'm hoping that I'm already like the leader of appearances. I don't know if I am, but I feel like I'm at least getting close to being the leader of appearances.
I mean, someone might be the leader for a short time until another one comes in, because we do have a good solid cycle of people that have been available, and I like it because it's a good crowd, a lot of different perspectives, but also a lot of favorites out there. I'm very happy that no one has commented saying we hate anyone who participates on the show, which is great.
Well, well, I hope people can tolerate me, but I'm joking, of course. I don't really don't know how many times each person was here, but I feel like at least I'm amongst the leading people. I don't know if I'm the leader, but I'm amongst the leaders. Will
We
you
can
give
put you
me
in the
that
top
or
six for sure. Like,
okay, I'll
all
take
right.
it.
Okay, with that, let's get started into this week. So, welcome to Scripts on Saturdays, the only screenplay review show on the interwebs discussing scripts, both professional and amateur, circulating around Hollywood, giving you, the TV and movie-going audience, a behind-the-scenes and inside track on what writers are pushing and what producers are buying. I am your host, the Script Doctor, and joining me this week for the sixth time, Price of Reason. So happy to have you here,
That's
man.
me. Glad to be here, man. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have this week we've got a period piece comedy that takes some liberties. It is called Dickens Vs Andersen. It's from the 2023 Blacklist. It placed 29th with only 12 votes. It is written by, I believe, a stand-up comic, but I'm not 100% sure. His name is Henry Oscar Thaler. His notable credits are basically being a writer's assistant on Real Time with Bill Maher for 2 years back in the late 20 teens. And this is his take on what is alleged to have been a true story where Hans Christian Andersen invited himself to stay with Charles Dickens. And the logline is as such: clumsy, awkward Hans Christian Andersen invites himself over to the country home of his idol, Charles Dickens, and overstays his welcome. Price, what is the synopsis of this screenplay?
Oh, okay. Let me pull that up right now. The synopsis. Okay. You did the log line, right?
That is correct, sir.
Yes, just did it. Synopsis. Aspiring writer Hans Christian Andersen. I have to do it again.
Go ahead.
Aspiring writer Hans Christian Andersen finally meets his literary idol Charles Dickens after a reading in Copenhagen. Impressed but caught off guard, Dickens casually extends an invitation for Andersen to visit him in England, never expecting him to follow through. To his surprise, Hans shows up at Dickens' doorstep, unannounced and full of enthusiasm. What begins as a polite gesture soon spirals into chaos as Hans disrupts Dickens' carefully structured life, jeopardizes his upcoming play, and threatens the stability of his entire career.
Riveting. Indeed.
I made it sound really interesting.
You definitely did. And speaking of interesting, I thought the premise was pretty interesting because this is a story that is kind of spread around over the ages. As I was saying before the show, I've been to England a few times. I never actually got a chance to go to any of the Dickinson's museum locations or tourist parts to see if this story is true or not. But the legend itself is, I think, quite interesting. What were your thoughts as you started to peruse this script, Price?
First of all, it's interesting. I try to say positive things. I mean, it's an interesting idea to explore a potential meeting between these two authors. There's merit there in terms of it's sort of I don't know if it's a myth or an urban legend. Some people believe this happened. Maybe it did happen. But in any case, if it did or if it didn't, the idea of these two authors meeting up and the interaction between them is a premise for something interesting to explore. Could be a good story.
Yeah.
Could even be a decent movie. And when I started seeing at the beginning that that's what it was going for, I was okay with it. I thought that there's something interesting. The problem that I had with it was, and I think right out the gate, was that I wasn't sure what this movie was going for in terms of tone, if that makes any sense.
No, it makes perfect sense because this has a very modern day contemporary feel to it. And I think that kind of portrays the atmosphere and setting of the screenplay. That was where I was kind of thrown off because you actually have points where Hans, he talks a little bit like a Valley Girl, where he actually uses the word like as in
I saw that
a few times, and I was thinking, well, whether it's a Danish person or a British person, that's not part of their lexicon. They would say he said this or he uttered that, or he wouldn't say like this, or like it was just kind of weird and jarring.
You know what it reminded me of? It reminded me that there was once this movie Holmes and Watson with
Gene
with
Wilder.
Will Ferrell
right.
and
John C. Reilly. Right. Yes.
It's not their most popular film, but I'll say that they spoke in it very kind of not really at the time they're really at. They kind of were speaking as if they're in modern day. Now, in that one, like that movie or don't like that movie, it was right out the gate meant to be almost a complete nonsensical movie. I mean, I think that some people didn't quite get it and they were expecting more of a real Sherlock Holmes situation in that movie, and that's probably why it failed. But they were going for absolutely doing the dumbest nonsense movie. Now, in this movie, it doesn't seem like they're going for nonsense, so him talking like a Valley Girl with the like that you said is kind of strange because you don't really understand, are they going for this kind of dumb thing or are they taking themselves seriously? This is where I started struggling, really even early on in the script. Yeah.
I mean, it felt like there's a couple of different approaches occurring at once when it comes to this story. For starters, we have a narrator speaking. We don't learn anything about the narrator until the very end, and ideally, what you kind of want to establish is that the narrator has this tone of voice. We know we kind of understand who the narrator is and how they're connecting to this. And I mean, and it just for the most time I thought this was a narrator like, a Patrick Stewart doing Ted type of thing, and then it switches, so it's like, oh no, it's not a Patrick Stewart type, it's a completely different type, and it's one of the characters that are kind of a side character in this story.
Yes, absolutely.
And I would have preferred a better setup for that, actually.
I would have preferred a better setup for that too. I think that having a Patrick Stewart like in Ted could have at least added to a little bit of atmosphere of amusement. The way they ended up doing this, I really didn't get what was good about it. But that's for me maybe even the least of the movie's or the screenplay's concerns. It's an issue, but it's not the major issue. I think that the major issue is that there was a way to kind of do this where you explore this story and even have certain beats or elements that could be even included in a story like this about how different they were, about how maybe they would possibly get on each other's nerves. I think
Hmm.
that it's interesting to see it, and maybe there's a way to pepper in a little bit of humor, but when it's kind of like dumb, stupid humor like this, you don't really understand again what's the anchor here, what's the tonal anchor, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, because it feels a little bit all over the place. Because there's some parts that echo um, the style of a Charles Dickens story, and then there's some parts that echo a little bit of the fairy tale aspect, and then there's this comedy which is very contemporary, kind of a mix between Odd Couple and Family Guy, and it feels very unfocused. Um, it would be
And
my best way to say.
especially that these are historical figures, and you don't really have a good grasp from the beginning how you're supposed to approach this thing. Is this just a dumb thing that you're looking at? Are you trying to look at it a little more seriously? And the movie really doesn't help you, at least in the earlier phases. It's not funny enough in this kind of bonkers funny way that you're like, okay, I get it. This is like bonkers, completely, off the rails type of crazy comedy. It's not that. It's not enough of that. It's not really historical because it's just there's so much creative liberties, and I think that that's where it starts to have problems.
I think so too. It's lacking some much needed discipline and focus, because if I were to try and say to the audience, "Oh, it's got a couple of these set pieces." I can only think of one, and it's not a very funny set piece. It's actually a very much of like something you'd see in like the Dewey Cox Talk Hard. Again, another Will Ferrell, John C. Riley, or not so much Will Ferrell, but mostly John C. Riley comedy. And
That one works though. I mean, really, I
yeah.
think that the only way you could sell this movie is with like a Will Ferrell and John C. Riley. But if
Mhm.
you bring them, you're probably hoping that they'll do a ton of improv and make this thing like the wackiest movie ever.
Yeah,
Because if
punch
you
it
don't
up.
go full on punching it up and wacky, and you're just going with whatever's in this screenplay, I don't think it's strong enough.
I don't think it is either, because the premise. I mean, there's also a little bit of like, what about Bob? The Bill Murray and Richard Dreyfuss comedy in it as well, where like Hans is Bob, and then Charles Dickens is the Richard Dreyfuss character, and
True,
Hans has not published anything at this point, which I think is a little bit of an anachronism, because
probably.
um, but he's enamored with Charles Dickens, who happens to be speaking in Copenhagen, and we get the first gimmick of Hans, which is that he sleeps with this wooden sign around his neck that says, "I'm asleep, not dead," because his fear is that people are going to think he's dead when they find him sleeping, and then put him in a coffin and then bury him alive. And it doesn't it doesn't resonate yet as a joke, because we actually
No,
haven't seen anything to justify why he needs to do this. Like, it's
right.
supposed to be delivered as some of a type of eccentricity, but it doesn't work, because it's just kind of an out of nowhere thing.
I agree with you. And that's part of the atmosphere that's not properly established. That going into it, it's still in those early pages. I, you know, you, when you sit, whether you're reading or you're sitting in the movie theater and watching, your brain has to somehow understand at least the genre or whatever it is that you're going for. Is this a You, Me, and Dupree with Charles Dickens and Hans Christian Andersen? Is this kind of like an Uncle Buck? Like, what am I going for here? And like I said, nothing happens here that's funny or hilarious enough to really put it over the top that I think this is just bonkers nonsense. I'm going to turn my brain off and really enjoy it. It's not that kind of movie, if that makes any sense.
No, but it really wants you to actually do that. Wants you to turn off your brain and try and enjoy this, and it doesn't earn that ability, because that first gag would only work if basically it opened up with two gravediggers knocking on the residence that Hans Christian Andersen is in, trying to get into his room because someone is like, I've been pounding on the door for hours, no one's answering, I think he's dead in there. They open it up, they see the sign, they check his pulse, they put a mirror under his nose, they don't see anything, they pick him up, they start to carry him out, and then he just suddenly wakes up. And he's like, that's why I wear the sign, stop doing this is the fourth time this week. Like, you get something out of that, where
Right.
it's actually occurred. And you just established that he's a very deep and heavy sleeper. But here's the other part too: is he wears this sign because he thinks that people will view him as dead while he's asleep, which would suggest a lot. Which is that, okay, yeah, you're a deep sleeper. But later on, we find out that he's not. That he's easily he's easily distracted and can't sleep. So you contradict. You contradict the gag pretty early on, but that's basically how we get set up that he's apparently paranoid, but we don't fully grasp the level. It just seems eccentric, and he's late to go see Charles Dickens, speak some of his work at a reading in Copenhagen. He can't get in because the auditorium is filled up, so he tries to sneak in through the window, and he gets stuck, and is unable to ask Charles a question. But somehow he manages to swap places with the cab driver, the carriage, driver, and talk to Charles as he takes him back to the docks where he's going to be boarding a ship that's back to England. And
Again, seems they didn't establish the nuttiness of the movie that would actually convince me that he replaced the driver and took him there.
yeah,
Personally, when it's happening, I'm like, really, is that where they're going with it? It's almost like another thing I was thinking. You know that movie Throw Mama from the Train?
yes,
You have Danny DeVito kind of looking up to Billy Crystal's author, and they're both authors, but one of them is an established author, and the other one is just kind of want to be an author. And I felt like they made this Hans character kind of like the Danny DeVito. Not exactly, but you know what I'm trying to say? There's even elements of that in there.
there's a little bit, and I like Throw Mama from the Train. I like it
Oh,
more.
I like that movie.
I love
that
it.
one works. It's in modern day. It's not going for some historical event, and
No.
it's fun for whatever it's supposed to be.
I loved it even more when I started becoming a professional writer, because I would meet people just like Danny DeVito, and they would pitch me a story just like how Danny DeVito's character did. I'm like, that is obscenely authentic and kind of freaky. And yeah, you're just like, oh, okay, it's not just satire. It's a little bit of true to life form of life, but we don't kind of get. I mean, even though the dynamic is kind of the same here, there's actually a lot more substance, and there's stakes a little bit for this, because here Charles, everything's going good for him. He's got his latest book out, and he's going to be performing in a play of his own works, which is based on factual. I believe he actually did, and people said he wasn't a good actor. And so everything is kind of going up with him, whereas in Throw Mama from the Train, Billy Crystal, he's struggling to get his next novel done. He can't even get the first sentence out without throwing out the page and then starting over. So he's got his own stakes, which is he's stuck teaching, and he wants to go back, get another great novel produced and published. And every time he thinks he gets close, he ends up, defeating himself into it. And then when he's trying to give advice to his students, and they ask him questions, that kind of re-inspires him until Danny DeVito starts getting a little bit too close to everything, and then they just kind of go nuts. This one here, it feels like he's trying to emulate a little bit of that, but he doesn't establish any really foibles for Charles at this point. Like, everything's going great for Charles. Nothing is going good for Hans. And even the attempt at jokes that gets them together, like Hans swapping with the carriage hand, and basically when Charles is like, well, what happened to the usual driver? And Hans is like, oh, he said his mom turned into a pumpkin. It's like is that what? I mean, is that does that fit the tone of this? Is that where you're going for? Where he's just gonna say something like that and try and pass it off as something that Charles is gonna be like, I think I'm being kidnapped or what have you. Like there's so many other things you could explore here, as opposed to just using fairy tale logic from Hans to
Right,
justify why he's here.
this goes back to the main problem that we keep addressing, that had the movie established that it's one of those type of movies where people are just saying nonsense. You know how sometimes you have a movie where there's a bit of goodwill from the viewer and from the people in the
Hmm.
like in the movie, which obviously nonsense is being spoken, but they're sort of not paying attention to it. And you know that it's that kind of movie that you're letting it slide, and the characters on screen are letting it slide, and it's a certain type of comedy. But I don't think that this movie establishes until those moments that this is in fact that type of comedy.
Yeah, it takes a while for it to get going.
I'll
Um,
give you an example.
okay, yeah, go
I don't
ahead.
know why I'm thinking of like Martin Lawrence. There's a movie that he's a criminal that pretends to be a police officer. I don't know why I thought of this movie, but almost every scene he says stuff that any normal person would know that it's a complete nonsense thing that he's doing. But it's played for comedy. Like you were saying, this guy is a stand-up comedy. It really showcases Martin Lawrence's comedy, and there's a bit of goodwill that you know that in real life these cops around him would never buy this crap,
Right.
but you kind of let it slide because it's Martin Lawrence doing his comedy. But you can't always get away with something like that. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Well, yeah. In one case, you have an established comic that has already earned that permission for the farcical in just being present in the story. Here, we don't
Right.
have that person. We don't know who's playing Hans. And so, because you don't know who's playing Hans, you have to really use your writing to earn that level of confidence in the fact that we are going to believe the absurd things he is going to say in order to achieve his goal. And
Right.
it's not
And
here at all.
and even people I see here are commenting, Black Knight. There's also something that he's like in medieval times or something. There's a lot of silly things,
Mhm.
but it's kind of you're not really seeing a movie with a plot. You're seeing Martin Lawrence do his jokes, and like you said, he's earned that status that he could make a movie, which is like that, and you know exactly what you're signing up for. But in this case, you don't really feel it, and the only way it would work is what I said from the beginning. If it was like Will Ferrell and John C. Riley, that would be a situation where even if it's complete nonsense, you think, okay, well that's where the movie is going. But nothing in this screenplay is tonally enough to represent that that's the type of movie they're going for, I guess.
No, it's not well established at all. And even though the conflict kind of hits right at the proper, pacing, we're at like, the 10 to 15 page mark, you get the inciting incident where Charles, he's late to get board his boat, and as he's grabbing his luggage and rushing to it, and he's like, I'm sorry, I'm terribly late. It was nice meeting you. And if you're ever in Kent, and then Hans interrupts and says, "Oh, you're inviting me?" And Charles is like, "Oh, I can't sign anything. Bye, 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 Harns," or whatever. He like keeps getting his name wrong, and then he's off. And what ends up happening is that we follow a little bit of Charles back to his home, and then Hans back to his home, where Hans is excited for the fact that he's been invited to visit Charles Dickens, and Charles is basically like, "Oh, I got all these things I have to do. I've got to work on this play. I don't have to worry about writing my next book. I have." We then find out that he has a 12-year-old son named Francis who is still preferring to sit in a stroller instead of getting up and walking places.
That seemed weird to me in the time period that they're in. Maybe I'm wrong, but that seemed kind of strange to me.
It seemed very strange. And then we have Dora, who's his daughter, who doesn't want to be a wife for a house or a
Uh,
homemaker.
Again, for the time that this is happening in, not convincing. It seems just out of left field, the thing with the chimney lady.
Yeah, and then the very weird the very weird like society that they have here with regards to like the Victorian dames, and they're called the VDs, and it's like, oh, you're doing a VD, venereal
VD
disease
joke.
joke.
Yeah, that was
Okay.
dumb. Really, low level. Like I said, I don't even know if today, because I think that they themselves, I dare say, are not in maybe their prime, although I'm sure they can still deliver fine performances. But
Mhm.
I'm saying, like, in their prime, when they're doing, like, Step Brothers, and you give Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly this script and just say, do whatever you want. We're bringing some cameras,
Yeah.
take the general idea of every scene here, and do whatever you want. That's the only way this movie works, I think.
Yeah, because even some of the contemporaryisms that they throw in there, like they introduce an agent for Charles named Mr. Morris, who's basically William Morris,
Right.
and it's supposed to be a joke on WME, which is a very notable William Morris Endeavor, which is a very notable literary agency and film agency in town. And it feels a little bit too inside baseball, like your general audience isn't going
Right.
to get that. And at this
No,
time,
I got it.
yeah,
I
I
got
mean,
it.
you
But
and I got it because, but
no, but I understand what you're
yeah.
saying, that maybe the regular person won't get it. That they're like William Morris British or whatever they were saying. Like, whatever. Even if you do understand the inside joke, it wasn't very funny, to be honest.
No, it felt different. It just did not
Obligatory.
felt, yeah, it just felt like it was they're trying to try hard, or too much of it's trying to draw a parallel to how difficult it is today to to write. But I mean, it just doesn't ring true to me in one sense because, as far as I know, Charles Dickens didn't have an agent, but he did work with publishers, and the reason his books were so long is that he was paid by the word. So the more words he wrote, the more money he would make. That's why he did it, and that's ripe for a joke because you could always have a publisher saying, Charles, listen, we know we pay you by the word, but this book is 10,000 pages long. Could you cut it down, maybe, or break it up into multiple volumes, like something that could be funny, and play into the actual times, as opposed to what we have here is we have a modern relationship between a agent and a writer, and we have no mention of the publisher, the people that actually print and sell the books. So we lose that that aspect, and it's very narrow. It just didn't
I
feel
think
like it explored the potential of it.
another thing would have maybe done something like you said with publishers, maybe like introduce us to two people like Mr. Simon and Mr. Schuster, and
Hmm.
they're both dicks. You know what I mean? They're both like snooty jerks. Maybe there's a joke there. I don't really know. You know,
Hmm.
and even that I don't know if people would know aside from people that actually pay attention to publishers. But maybe there was a way to make a joke there. The William Morris one is very, very kind of like you said. It's an insider joke, and it's one that'll just fly above most people's head. And even the people that understand it don't really get much out of it, anyways.
Yeah, and it pretty much, yeah, it just feels like it's not fully refined. So the attempt in comedy keeps they keep making. I mean, the writer keeps swinging for the fences, but he keeps on hitting like fouls, I guess, in this case for the baseball analogy. Because when we get introduced to like Gad Hill's place, which is where Charles Dickens lives, he introduces this obligatory good person law and sign, which is weird because I don't think those were a thing at the time. And the jokes that they try to say here is that in this estate we believe Jews didn't kill Christ, women can own property, and the poor mustn't be whipped without cause. And I'm like, that, what? Is this
Yeah,
supposed?
that was just random too. I wasn't like, a big fan of that joke. I just thought it was whatever.
I think it would have been funny if they changed mustn't to must, because then that shows a hypocrisy to it, right? The poor must be
Yeah, you're
whipped
right.
without cause, because that's
Okay.
funny because
That
you
would
have all
have been
these other
funny.
things there, but no, it's too virtuous, and I'm like, this is not this. You take a good 7 lines of space on the page for this particular piece, and it's not funny, and
Not
and,
funny.
and it's supposed to be a comedy script.
No, throughout this screenplay, it's sort of like I said, it really reminded me of You, Me, and Dupree. I don't know if that's a good.
Hmm.
It's weird that I'm saying that about this movie, but the house guest that won't leave, and that gradually, like the girlfriend is always a little more in the Dupree case, but here it's the wife more forgiving towards him. In this case, he's also, and this is maybe I don't know if to say an Uncle Buck or whatever it is, but he's like developing relationship, like friendships with the kids. and everything that goes on here really plays with a lot of beats that we've seen from those type of movies. But somehow, the overall package, I don't know that I necessarily really wanted a movie that does this. And when I was reading it, there was no moment that I read it that I thought, "Wow, I get it now. It's such a great idea. I'd love for this screenplay to happen."
You know what's tragic is that when I saw the log line, I'm like, this is definitely the type of thing that'd be up my alley. Like, let's have a very, of its time period piece of these two opposites together, one imposing on the other, and how are they going to pull it off? And then I'm 10 pages into the script, and it's like, this is a premise that is outside the weight class of this writer.
I agree with you. You know what type of writers you needed? You needed people that can do high quality, dry British humor that have like these two. What was that movie with Emma Stone that she's Olivia Olivia Colman.
Olivia Colman and Emma Stone? Is that like The Help?
No, no, that's a movie that I don't prefer. It's one that they're in kind of in England in some kind of castle or something palace or
Is it The Favorite? The Favorite? Is that it?
I think that's what it was called.
Yeah,
So
okay.
let's say somebody that wrote that screenplay that would sort of that was a movie that was supposedly happening not in our day, but whoever wrote it had this kind of had pretty good ideas for this type of dry humor. I don't know, I haven't seen that movie in a while. I don't know how much I loved it, but I'm saying it achieved the not happening today with humor. That's a good balance. If they would have had that kind of attitude towards this movie, meaning there's dry humor, there's things that are happening that kind of will make you smile or be intriguing or even crack you up a bit, but not it doesn't have to be like gross out or complete bonkers humor. I don't think it's that kind of movie, if that makes sense.
No, I hear you because I mean, yeah, you got God, that's I think it's Deborah something and something McNamara who wrote that. They were pretty good at capturing that type of humor.
I don't even know. It's not that I'm putting them on a pedestal.
No,
Really,
no, but they captured something with that film. Yeah.
they were able, at least the only thing I can say, that's positive about them, and I don't know anything. And again, it's not even a movie that I sit around and watch all the time. But I remember at the time I saw it and I thought, okay, they took something that's not happening in our day. It's sort of, 100 years earlier, whatever it is, but they managed to insert, even though that they were talking very kind of in a British way and all that, they inserted certain humor that was more dry, but you still understood why it was humorous and why the situations were absurd and a bit funny. And I think that that type of approach to this type of story with Dickens and Christian Andersen hanging out like this, that kind of approach could have been interesting if you had, and you said it, the writer, this guy that used to work for Bill Maher as the assistant of Bill Maher or whatever it is.
Writing assistant, yeah.
Yeah, he's not even like the guy that writes. He's the assistant to the guy that writes for Bill Maher. Maybe doing this kind of period piece was, like you said, punching above his belt. I don't even remember now the name of this. Who wrote this screenplay?
This was written by, and even I'm even forgetting some of it a little bit because it's written by Henry Oscar Thaler. So
I don't have anything personal against the guy. I don't know him, but I just will say that maybe going from Bill Maher being an assistant to an assistant there, he should have done something a little more like that's happening in modern times, or I don't know what, but I think that this England with these sort of titans authors, he didn't seem to nail this, in my personal opinion.
I think this type of premise would have been perfect for Monty Python to do, or better yet, Gene Wilder, because he knows how to. Before he passed away, he knew how to balance how to get on each other's nerves types of character archetypes.
Maybe even a prime Mel Brooks together with Gene Wilder putting together a movie like this. I think that would have been interesting.
Yeah, because it's they know those types of tones. This
And
writer.
it almost seems it seems like there's a moment in the movie that he wanted to be Mel Brooks with a Simintov and Mazeltov. That kind of felt like he was
Yep.
thinking about history of the world or something, and it's like, dude, you didn't earn this. But sorry, go on.
No, no,
I
you're right.
interrupt.
Simintov and Molotov. There's another joke where there's a running gag, or at least a running thing, that Charles Dickens was a magician at some point, or at least was good at magic. And he says he's retired, but in order to show up, his son's birthday and entertain the kids, he decides to take out a trick and ends up setting the mime on fire. And the mime doesn't scream at all, which on its own it could be funny, but it just did not feel like it fit properly within this film, because we've never
No.
we weren't inching towards that level of absurdity at all.
No, and sometimes, you sit there and you think, how great if I can take all these crazy ideas and throw them into one screenplay. And even if in your head you thought that these were great isolated ideas, there has to be a thread, an overall atmosphere, and a sort of story that really feels organic when you do this kind of stuff. And like you said, I think you said Gene Wilder, and then I said Mel Brooks. Could totally imagine that in their prime, I'm talking like 70s, Brooks and
Wilder,
Wilder.
yeah.
I think that if you gave them this screen, like this story, this premise, and said you got to do this thing, there would be something funny that would come out of it. That would be a movie you'd understand, but also you'd understand the tone from the first scene. Like 20
100%.
seconds into the movie, as the titles are running, you'd probably already understand exactly what tone you're getting, and it would be consistent and continue to stay true to that tone throughout. And the writing would be, in my opinion, more sophisticated, the jokes more witty, and they could have pulled it off.
Yeah, I think they could have, because it plays into some interesting, well, not interesting, it plays into some very common tropes, which is that when Hans finally shows up to the Charles Dickens residence, Dickens is upset to see him, even though it took him a while to realize who he was. But the rest of the family is all excited that he's going to be staying, like just instantly. And it just felt kind of weird that Hans would be so charming to this family and they would just buy into it, because this is a family that is essentially shaped by Charles Dickens. Like, his wife, again, is a Victorian dame. Like, she has a certain code that she'd have to follow, and someone that's as eccentric and particular as Hans Christian Andersen is depicted in this story would definitely rub her the wrong way, and yet it doesn't at all. And it just did not feel authentic for this. And even the gags that they try to do, where even though Charles was like, I didn't intend him to actually stay here, and Catherine, his wife, is saying, well, since you gave him the invite, we should honor it. It's the one thing we have to do. And it's not like she's saying so begrudgingly. It's almost like she's saying so as like, I want to get to know this person in the script, which I think it would have been better if it was a begrudgingly thing, where she's like, listen, you, my foolish husband, said this. If we want to maintain our reputation, we should honor it and host him for a short while and then, ease him out. And instead of hatching that type of plan, it's no, the family, all the children love Hans for some reason. The wife adores him, and they set him up in the guest room, and he's, makes it a mess like it's his own home that we see earlier, and then claims that something is wrapping the window and he can't sleep. And instead, what the wife, Catherine, does is she's like, oh, you can take my twin bed, my side of the bed. I'll go stay with the children, and then you can spend the night in here, because the way that they've set up the scene is that Catherine and Dickens, they sleep in separate beds, and they're divided by like a bookcase. And right. The joke is when Hans gets in there, the bookcase is gone, the beds are smushed together, and it's supposed to be like, a planes, trains, and automobile joke with Steve Martin and John Candy.
Totally thought of that, yeah.
And it's just like, it just felt unearned, and it felt too lazy. Because it's like, oh, thanks for moving the bookcase and putting the beds together. That increases the airflow. It's like, that's too contemporary of an idea of dialogue at this point.
Right. And the thing is that it's like I said, nothing establishes See, when you see history of the world, you're looking at historical events, but there always is that like you're the people on screen, they're all winking to you. You know, this
Yes.
is historical events through a lens of kind of silly things, and you feel it right away. You feel it, and it never leaves you. That feeling. Nothing happens here that would suggest there would be that kind of thing with Steve Martin and John Candy and Planes, Trains, and Automobile. Although they kind of tried to do that dynamic between Charles and Hans, but it never really feels right.
It really doesn't, because I think what hurts this is that we don't really get a true sense of who Charles Dickens is in this story before he meets Hans. Like, the closest we get is he's reading his own work, and then the next scene is he's talking to Hans in the carriage. And for Hans, the only sense we get is, he's talking to his best friend Magda, and the next scene is he's trying to get a question to him, and then boom, he's talking with Charles. So we get a little bit more of establishment with Hans, but even what we are seeing is just he's an eccentric, and we're not really, and everybody around him seems to be kind of used to that, which doesn't really help me define his character in that very short amount of time. And so we put these guys together so quickly, or too quickly in my opinion, to the point where I can't see the contrast and have fun with it. Because for Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, we get a few scenes of just Steve Martin trying to do his thing and get home. And then we get that one brief moment where John Candy's character Dell steals his cab, and he gets really upset. And then when he finally gets to the airport, he's sitting there waiting for his plane, and across from him is John Candy's character doing his thing. And that's where we start to see their introductions, and that's how we get to it, because now we're from the point of view of Steve Martin's character, and we are learning about John Candy's character through his eyes, where in this situation they've inverted it. We started seeing Hans first, and now we're learning about Charles, who's the straight man in this comedy, through the kooks, the clowns' eyes, and I don't think that's how this dynamic is supposed to work, right? Because
maybe it should have been like the focus should have been Charles more, and
this guy just pops up.
Pops up. That would have been probably a little more interesting. Also, there was a part in the screenplay that it's like a Ramones track is playing, and man, I don't really that it didn't earn that either. I mean, why would a Ramones track be playing in this movie now?
There's another part that is peppered throughout the script, which is the scene descriptions are more scene directions, which is uncouth. You don't want to do that. You don't want to tell people, like, there's a few times where they say, this thing is shocking, and we hold on that for a beat. It's like, no, you don't get to determine that. The way the scene performs determines that. You don't get to try and force that in. And he does that a number of times.
He's trying to lead the reader how to feel with what he wrote, and if he would have written it properly, there was no need to lead them. They would just do whatever it needs to do.
Yeah, like Hold on the Shock was uttered a couple of times for scenes that I would not consider shocking.
Right, I agree.
And then, and as this progresses, there's also like spelling errors start popping in. Like there's one of the gags is that Hans listens to Catherine, who tells the story of why she's a Victoria dame, and how she worked very hard to do so because she was kind of considered ugly as a child, and they called her the Ugly Duckling, and that's supposed to inspire Hans to write his Ugly Duckling story. And then he tells it, which gains him attention, and he's being turned into an overnight success because of this single story. And he's interrupting Charles as he's rehearsing for the play of his own work that's been adapted to the stage. And the actors all decide, you know what, we don't want to do Charles's play. We want to do the Ugly Duckling play. And Charles rightfully saying, well, we go on in a week. There's no way we can do it in time. And they're like, no, it's no fine. We can do that. Even Hans is also going to be the director. So we have all these things that happen in the background that just kind of gets flooded through.
That was just so out of left field. And it's another one of those moments where I felt that the movie didn't establish an atmosphere that would allow for all of that to happen, if that makes any sense.
Right. Because, it's just a bunch of set pieces which don't always complement each other, so they feel very much isolated, like vignettes. Another good one that's isolated that could have been funny, but just didn't really hit too hard, is when Hans is going through Speaker's Corner in London, and you've got all these crazy people spouting off their own whatever. And then there's this one guy who basically says, in the future, we'll be looking at little screens that'll be moving pictures and stuff, and they'll be wireless. Like, he's basically just telling what it is today. And then, the guys in white coats pick him up and take him away for being an insane person. And you're like, oh, that could have worked in something like a Mel Brooks's History of the World comedy. But here it just doesn't, it just feels so out of place because it's just there. It's there just to be there. It's a very isolated joke. It doesn't fit the tone. It doesn't fit any of the other stuff that's going on. It doesn't fit with regards of like, oh, if they made it like where Hans Christian Andersen always like stood on the corner in Copenhagen and would spout off stories until the police would say, hey, move along now, the kids are late for school, that type of thing. That would make sense because then he'd seek that out in order to practice his work. And then you could actually show, well, who are the other people that come to this corner? Well, you always have the crazy person that says the end is nigh. You have another person that talks about witchcraft. And then you have this one guy who talks about the future. And if that was like a consistent thing across all the speakers' corners in Europe, you could have a fun joke with that. Kind of like how in Young Frankenstein, when Victor Frankenstein is in the train, he's in England, and there's this elderly couple talking about their grandchild who is playing with himself in his bedroom, and then we cut to him to Germany, and then we have a German couple in German saying the exact same thing. That's the joke. Like, that's what they're establishing there is, wherever you go, there's, even though the languages are different, there's still some similar problems or similar situations. This thing just kind of stuck out like a sore thumb to me, and we didn't get the atmosphere of celebrity going on. So like wherever Dickens went in England, nobody really seemed to, fall to their feet and praise him for being, such a talented author or anything of that nature. So when stuff starts happening like that to Hans, it just doesn't feel like it's true to the tone of the script, which is all over the place.
It feels like the person that wrote this saw a lot of these movies that we've been discussing, and he just said, well, if I do this, it'll be like that movie. If I do this, it'll be like that movie. If I do this, it'll be like that movie. And he thought maybe he could cleverly just take it from a bunch of very different ones, different genres, different atmospheres, different types of comedies, and somehow it all come together. But at the end, I think that there's no shortcuts here, and it doesn't come together.
No, I think... No, it really does kind of fall apart. Like even to the point where, like, Hans, like, there's a dog named Biscuit that lives at the Dickens' home. It's the family dog. And Hans is actually very much afraid of and dislikes the dog. Not cruelly or so, he's just in fear of it. And then he manages to let the dog escape into the woods and is relieved, but then hides the fact that he's the guy that let the dog out. And when we see the dog again, it's now become rabid, and it attacks Charles Dickens. And Charles then starts having hallucinations where he's meeting some of the characters and the silly stories that Hans has been sharing with him, trying to get advice to write better. And by this point, he has managed to get Hans so drunk that he passes out and then throws him into a wooden coffin and then pays some guy to bury him. But he doesn't.
That really felt already off the rails at this point. Like, this was the point where I was thinking to myself, sorry, and I don't know how else to say it. I was thinking, when is this screenplay over already? Like that part where he wants to get rid of him. That was already, I don't know. It's just, this thing, it follows certain beats. Mm-hmm. On one hand, the author, if I had to say something mildly positive, and I'm not really, it's not a compliment, it feels like the author has this kind of idea and he's trying to sort of commit to it. There's the mild moments that I could appreciate something very, very mild, but so many more moments where it just goes off the rails. And as we enter that kind of third act, I really didn't like where it was going. Also, this idea that, like, he's taken away his agent, he's taken away his play, he's now trying to look like this, it does that. It was too much, you know what I mean? And there weren't enough funny things going on that would make me kind of overlook it and say, okay, this is a bonkers type of Steve Martin, John Candy comedy.
Right.
It didn't give me that vibe. So all of this was happening. It just started annoying me, if that makes sense.
No, because what you're describing is something that we've kind of seen occur, sadly, recently over the last decade, which is a superficial understanding of the things that were well regarded in the 90s, 80s, and previously. It's like, oh, I want to do something like trains, planes, and automobile. Well, what that's about? Well, it's about these two funny guys together. It's like, no, it's about a father who wants to get home to his family and a man who's a widower who is trying to find some meaning in his life because his entire life has become the road. And these two coming together, even though they have comedic hijinks, end up helping each other achieve what they need most. That is the substance of that movie.
There's a lot of depth to that movie. I know that because of the performances, you laugh, and there certainly is a lot of comedy to enjoy. With again, Steve Martin in his prime and John Candy in his prime, that's a great movie. But there is heart. There is heart in that movie, and I think in those final scenes with John Candy, where he realizes, which I really like that moment that he pieces together so many things that he didn't understand until that moment about him, and that he invites him. I think that the movie, in spite of the roller coaster of comedy and strange, bizarre situations, there's something at the end that's satisfying about that ending, and it can only be achieved in Planes, Trains, and Automobile because there was good writing of a screenplay. There was an actual structure and an idea there beyond the great performances. That's just one of those situations where everything comes together really well in that movie.
Yeah, and this script was more. I think the writer was leaning far too much on trying to be funny as opposed to trying to make the characters something we would want to laugh with, people we would want to laugh with and see their hijinks. I mean, one of the biggest no-nos you should ever do, especially if you're a screenwriter, is never put into your screenplay something that says, I'm not that creative. Because the writer actually writes that line in his story around like page 55, 56 or so, where he's trying to describe, oh, we're going to the indentured house, where you drop off a kid to pay off your debts because they're going to work. And he basically says, yeah, it looks just like that scene from that Oliver Twist movie. I'm sorry, I'm not that creative. It's like, dude, you're a screenwriter. Your entire job is creativity. If you say that openly, we should not be taking you seriously at all.
Right. I know exactly what you mean. Not to mention, now that you mentioned, I don't know why I thought of this now, the singing prostitutes, also dumb,
yeah.
in my opinion. Not earned and out of left field. Nothing establishes that would happen and be funny. You need to like warm up the crowd for a funny development like that. And if you don't have the laughs and the proper setup, then that just seems totally random and dumb to me.
Yeah, because I just didn't. It was okay. So they do all these things, and then all of a sudden they start singing. And what was it called? It was like the they're looking for an inn because the wheel on the wagon broke, and the only thing that was available is called the humping ass, which.
Again, suddenly from a situation that they're in England and nothing suggests that type of humor. Suddenly there's that type of humor, and once it's there, it just feels like, again, like a piecemeal.
Yeah.
If this was a raunchy comedy from the beginning, I'd say, okay, well, this is already in line. And back to what I was saying, Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder could pull this off. This guy can't.
Yeah, because it still comes out of left field. Because the way that you would ease into this is that you would go to an inn that has an innuendo name, but it's not blatantly obvious, right? And everybody there looks more dignified and fine. And, Charles and Hans says, yes, we just like a room, please. And they'd be like, well, we have all these other amenities. Would that be, and then, various other points of innuendo, which slowly eases into what this establishment might actually be. But Hans and Charles just don't care. They don't register. They just like, no, we just need the room, what have you. And then they're asleep, and then they're woken up by thumping from the next room. And then you start realizing, oh, wait, this is a bordello. and that's the punchline. Right. The punchline has to come after the fact, the point where it's too late for them to go back, where now they're stuck here and they have to deal with this thing. And that's where you can actually have the fun, as opposed to what they do is they introduce the punchline before the setup.
Right. Absolutely, I agree with you. And, again, I think of that movie, that favorite. that if they're both in a room and then they suddenly hear the banging in like in a more serious way, they understand that they're in a brothel. That could be sort of funny if cooked in the right kind of dry British way,
Hmm.
but because there was a way to make this movie as a mild comedy, this kind of not Monty Python and Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder have their more kind of obvious comedy. I'm saying that this could have been something that's like giving you this scenario of these two guys in strange situations, but doing it in a way that on one hand takes itself seriously, but on the other hand has this kind of under the surface type of dry, tongue-in-cheek humor
Hmm.
that's not as obvious, but you can feel it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, something that just requires like the engagement. So it's able to hook you in and you're paying attention and you're able to start picking up the clues so that you can indeed laugh at it and have fun. You know, the art of good satire and subtext, right? Where it's like, oh, okay, I'm not going to blatantly just put it out on the surface for you. I'm going to give you all the tools needed for you to put it together so that you can enjoy solving the puzzle as opposed to me just telling you the answer. Like that's one of the most entertaining things about a film, especially like if you're writing a good mystery or a comedy, is that they are feeding you points of information that as the story progresses, you start piecing it together, which gives you more involvement into the story. And then when you come to that conclusion, you get the catharsis, you get the laugh, or you get the revelation and the satisfaction of like, oh, I figured it out, oh, I solved it, and then the confirmation from the punchline at that point. And if you do it well, they should all come in sync with the audience's processing of that information. This part here, I mean, it really does feel very stand-uppy in the sense like, okay, I'm gonna say something funny, whether there's a setup to it or not doesn't matter because the concept is funny and the audience will kind of do the work. But you're relying too much on the audience to do the work at that point. And when you're telling a story, especially a comedy story, there's a strong point of view that you have to establish. And that point of view, once you establish it and the audience understands what that point of view is, that's when you start building up and playing into the jokes, as opposed to, say, something like what this writer probably did a lot more of, which is do a couple of quick bits for the real-time Bill Maher show, or just the general easy low-hanging fruit opening monologue style humor, which is, oh, this is in the news, and then punchline. There's no joke.
Right.
The news itself is a setup, but the news itself is never really much of a setup. You always have to build more to it. But with Bill and Maher stuff, at least around that period, 2016 to 2018, it was very, very easy, low-hanging fruit stuff, and then boom, you just come up with a funny little quip. And
Yeah, I mean, it's like a collection, and somebody wrote it here, and I was just thinking it. Somebody said that it was very skitty. It feels like a collection of sketches, and none of these sketches are especially brilliant, but it feels like somebody that had maybe 30 sketches involving these characters and just kind of forced them into a screenplay of sorts.
yeah, yeah, because, I mean, the mark of a good story is, oh, I could describe the character without saying their name, and you'd understand who I'm talking about. And
Right.
I can't do that for any of these characters. Like I don't even understand the whole Francis Dickens joke, why he wants to stay in the stroller instead of just get up and walk. And
Don't
then
understand that. Or the chimney girl. I don't know why she wants to sweep the chimney either. That's just annoying. And it doesn't. I mean, what are you trying to do? Like a modern day feminism with a thing? And during that day and age, that daughter would do whatever she's told. And I think that the guy wouldn't be in the stroller. That kid. All of that seemed like dumb. And again, if it was a situation that everything is proper, like the way it was then, but then there's something modern that happens that kind of is out of place, but it's played for laughs, maybe there's a way to make it work, but not in the way that he did it.
yeah, like if we were establishing that everybody in the Charles Dickens family was like an elitist eccentric, like very aristocratic, then you could kind of make fun with that because you're like, oh, he's teaching his son to be highbrow, high class, all this stuff, and he's taken it such to heart that he feels like it would be beneath him to walk like a normal peasant, and that's why he wants to be wheeled around all the time.
For example, I just thought of this, and I haven't seen this movie in a while. I hope I'm remembering it correctly. In History of the World, isn't there a part like in ancient Rome where the real Hugh Hefner is there talking about a centerfold or his magazine or whatever it is? That's That's funny. If I could be wrong, but I don't know why. I think that such a thing happens, like a cameo of sorts. That's kind of funny because obviously he wouldn't be there at that period of time talking about it. But the fact that he's there and it's actually him is so silly and ridiculous that it fits the nonsensical atmosphere that's been created.
And you know, the way that they created that atmosphere comes from like the very beginning when they said man created art, and afterwards that they created art, they created the art critic, and the art critic is just a guy who stands up on a higher rock and he urinates on the piece of art in the wall in the cave. And it's like, okay, there we go, we got, that's the tone. You know,
Right.
we're gonna
Right.
take the subtext of what an art critic actually does say about art that they don't like, and we're going to actually make it literal, which is that he's peeing on the art.
For sure. Yes, I agree.
And yeah, and I wish that, I mean, the thing is that this writer, he uses a narrator, which really just provides a little bit of context, but there's nothing funny that the narrator says.
No, nothing. Nothing.
And with a narrator, you could do a lot. I mean, I personally don't like narrators in stories. I think they're too much of a handicap. They do the work that you should be able to show on
No,
screen.
but if it was a narrator that's saying one thing and you're seeing something else,
Mm-hmm.
I think that that sometimes is funny. When you have like a juxtaposition of like a narrator trying to present something, but then in reality it's not what he's saying, those are moments where you could take the idea of a narrator, especially in a movie like this with historical things and a bit of light humor, whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there was something to do here if you insisted on the narrator. I personally don't know if I would have gone with a narrator, but if you forced me, I would have done something like that.
Yeah, well, there's that. Or you take something like, for instance, Ron Howard in Arrested Development, where he's partially narrating, but he's also commentating. He's making fun of what's happening, right? And the narrator, the narrator's not used in any form, really. Like I could not tell you anything of point that the narrator has a value with
Nothing,
the
nothing. It's
script.
tied to the. I don't want to spoil. It's tied to that same stupid thing, that other thing that we see throughout the movie, and there's no payoff. It doesn't all tie together in a way. I think that at the end you're supposed to be like, wow, that was the narrator, and it's really like just, oh, that's the narrator. That's the vibe that I got instead of the wow.
Yeah, no, I got that vibe too, because like even then, like the narrator, like here's a little bit snippet from the opening. So you have the narrator saying, "Oh, they say never meet your heroes. I say heroes best steer clear of their fans. Oh, sure, the adulation is nice, the letters, the homemade cookies, but you never know what happens when you cross paths." Like this, it's one point. It's basically taking one phrase and then just kind of repeating it line by line by line, over and over again. There's nothing new to it, right? Like there's no value there. And throughout the entire script, we get more and more of that. I'm just looking here, just to see if there's some more really quick. Oh yeah, then there's commentary. So when Hans is, freaking out early on, the narrator interrupts and says, "Yes, Hans was, as the Americans say, just a weird MFer." It's like, really? Like,
Yeah, that's a weird thing too. I didn't like that.
it and then they say, well, what boat did Hans set you aboard to sail from from the shore over to England? It's like the HMS Thickbottom. Like, oh, that's your joke there. I mean, I don't think that was a real boat, and I don't even know why Her Majesty would christen a boat with such a name. As absurd as some things in history do appear, there is a threshold. There's a certain threshold. So yeah, like
I
we,
agree.
it just, it's, yeah. I have to go back and say, like, this script should, like, the premise alone should have warranted someone of some significant comedic talent to have fun with this, and I am shocked that it placed in the top 30.
Yeah, I don't know how it would place in the top 30, but I mean, Hollywood does do a lot of strange things. I think that there's an idea here, a kernel of idea that's interesting. The premise, if you just told me about it, I'd say, okay, this is interesting. Let's see where they go with this. and this is just probably out of all the options of what they could do with it, maybe the worst thing they could do. I don't know. I haven't read something worse than this, but it's certainly not the best thing they could have done. And again, it's not a personal attack. I don't know this writer, don't know anything really about him. I'm just saying that this thing doesn't work for me.
No, it really doesn't. I think probably part of what makes it not work is it's it's taking a legend or a myth of sorts and playing into it, but it's compressing it down to a very short period of time, or at least it's compressing the introduction to these characters and their conflict into a very short period of time, because as the myth goes, for years Charles Dickens and Hans Christian Andersen were writing letters to each other, where Hans was asking for advice and Charles was kind of politely, giving him a tidbit here and there and then brushing him off. And at one point after many years, that's when Hans shows up to surprise Charles at his home. And that could actually have been a lot more fun, because you could have started this story with Charles having just received a letter from Hans, talking about his efforts in shaping this latest fairy tale that he's writing, whatnot. And Hans is like, okay, I'll write him back. And his wife says, like, you've been writing him for years. Like, yeah, well, it's once in a while. He's just another author. I'll never meet him. He's fine. He's doing his own thing. We see a little bit of establishment of what Charles Dickens' life is in England. And then he comes home to find Hans there. And then we start seeing, okay, he's going to be friendly at first because they corresponded for years, hosts him for a day or two, and then we start seeing how eccentric and crazy and inconvenience, and as much of an inconvenience as Hans is, over the following set of scenes, to the point where we should be seeing a deconstruction of Charles Dickens. Like, his sanity should be waning thin, and everybody in the household should be just, in conflict with, we want him out of our house, but it's just very un-British of us to kick him out so soon, especially when he's technically been invited, right? Like, you have a status game between society's perceptive and what it personally is wanted by these characters, and none of that forethought has been expressed at all in the execution of this script.
I agree. And I think we felt that way from the first moment. Even when we talked before the show, I think we both had similar sentiments about the wasted opportunity or premise that could have been interesting, but ultimately falls flat. It is what it is, I guess. Sometimes people don't do the best job with a decent premise.
Yeah, I mean, and even when you, as I mentioned before, when you get to the point of what I guess you could call the screenplay's climax, where Dickens does attempt to bury Hans Christian Andersen alive by hiring a guy who's apparently a pervert that hangs around at the theater for some reason to shovel dirt on the grave, but he only shovels just a couple of shovels of dirt and then walks away. So obviously he's not going to be buried alive. Everything that follows through after that is it reminded me a little bit of The Great Outdoors, with the mud and the rain and all that stuff, and then trying to correct a mistake. But it just, again, as we've been talking for the past hour, we keep coming up with other movies that this screenplay essentially borrows from and wedges in to try and make this story work, which I think is what leads to why it's not a very good screenplay. Instead of maybe leaning into the history of this encounter and doing the research as to what all the problems that Hans brought to Charles Dickens and vice versa, that could have been your foundation for the comedy, as opposed to, let me just watch a bunch of these movies of these odd couples together annoying each other and ape that in the context of Hans Christian Andersen and Charles Dickens.
And it comes off as lazy because there's no real heart behind the movie. Even a dumb movie has to have something.
Yes. Oh, man.
So, it is what it is. Like I said, I personally I didn't love this screenplay.
No, well, I mean, there we go. That's your answer. So, so if this was going to be a green light or a pass price, uh,
No, this is a pass.
this is
You know,
yo, I yeah.
there have been cases where you showed me like a movie where they're on skiing on a mountain, and I told you, you know what? If it was a low enough budget, and maybe you bring a guy in to do a little patch up on the screenplay, maybe you could still make it work as kind of a low direct to DVD type of situation.
Hmm.
But this isn't even that. This one is like back to the drawing board, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I kind of I share that sentiment quite strongly actually. This excuse me, this screenplay, this idea is just outside of the skill set of this writer. Um and I think he has to go back to formula essentially. I think what he should do, try and find some of those letters between Charles Dickens and Hans Christian Andersen. I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
someone has found them and they've been archived. I would look for every single newspaper report about Charles Dickens during the year that Hans was staying with him. Because you didn't say from a year, but like 5 weeks or so. But just find something to try and get into the head of how the world was viewing Charles at this point, and build that up, and just completely throw out all the ideas that you would have, or the inspirations that you get from those 80s and 90s movies of buddy, odd couple situations, and just try and play into the authenticity of that period of time, and ditch the brothel thing. Save that joke for some other movie because it could work in another movie, just not this. And focus more on these two characters with goals, because Hans's goal is really he just wants to get published and share his stories because he's afraid of writing them down, or he feels like he can't write them down. And that there's no stakes there because he's not struggling for cash apparently, because he could afford to take a boat trip, to England.
Right.
So he's not struggling for cash. So incorporate something of that, because that's it's an easy conflict, but it's a valid one. Everybody has experienced money problems to some degree, with very few exceptions. The other part too is give some stakes for Charles, right? Like, if Charles Dickens is saying, I am going to retire as an author and I'm going to explore life as an actor, it's aristocratic and eccentric, but lean into that. Why is that important to him? Like, why does he want to do this? Explore that idea before he kind of comes back around and says, you know what, I'm going to go back and be an author again. It's far more dignified of a career choice.
Right.
Give him that arc.
And I was also thinking, and this is based on stuff that you even said before about the celebrity and the stakes and things like that. This movie, if it had the right tone, could have started off. Charles Dickens is in Denmark or whatever it is. He arrives there, and like you said, he's a celebrity. Everybody's taking his picture. You have reporters with those old school flash bulbs kind of thing, and people are just like kissing his ass. I don't know. Did they have the flash bulbs then? Is that
I think well, it's 1857, so photography was relatively still new, but it was around.
maybe one, like, just at the event you have some one camera that's like old, like an old camera, the kind that you requires this guy to put like a that curtain over your head. I don't know. You know what I mean? You just have at least one,
Yeah.
kind of like in Back to the Future, Part 3, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
have that one camera or something, so you don't have, but you do have reporters, maybe just people trying to hound him or talk to him. And you already established that he's this big celebrity. Meanwhile, at this event that he's talking, I don't know how Hans cleverly was able to slip in there. And before he goes on stage to maybe address some people, or before he comes out to talk to people, he somehow manages to place himself there, where he maybe asks for an autograph from him and says that he's also a writer and he'd love to come visit him. And the guy just kind of blows him off. Of course, when you come to this, of course. And then he just goes on stage. Maybe even on his way to the stage, he has like kind of a snarky little comment of how he thinks that that Hans guy that he doesn't even know who he is an idiot. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And he goes on stage, he does his thing, everybody's cheering for him. He's number one. They're all like clapping. He's the best. And the next thing you know, he's in England minding his own business, and the guy arrives. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? I don't need 70 hours of the guy riding the coach and the thing and stealing the horses and the pumpkin. None of that, and the weird curses. None of that is necessary. He's
Right.
at home with his wife. You establish the type of family man that he is, and suddenly, as everything is supposedly going great for Charles Dickens, this jerk shows up
Yeah, just out of nowhere.
out of
Um,
nowhere.
no, I mean, yeah, that would. I think that would work better to a degree.
Right. I mean, that's why I'm saying there was an idea here that could have actually been interesting. It's like sometimes I don't know if to say keep it simple, stupid, or whatever you want to say.
Well, that is the term.
Sometimes, what'd you say?
That is the proper term.
And I think that that fits here. Sometimes you don't need to watch 70 buddy movies which had crude humor in it and try to shove them all into this thing. Sometimes you got to think of what kind of story am I looking to tell. And if you don't have a story, then you don't really have much to work with.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the fleeting parts of this script is that it's got characters that are not well defined. It's got gags that don't always land. And the reason that it's lacking is because there's not really a story at the center of it all.
Yeah, like we were saying before, even those movies that are screwball, whatever it is, Groundhog Day, the idea, the concept is good. Even though it has Bill Murray and he's doing whatever he's doing, there is an idea there, and
Hmm.
it does have some depth and heart to it. That's just an example, I thought of immediately. Even that kind of Uncle Buck, whatever it is, there's still something more to those movies than what we're getting here.
Yeah, and I think that I mean every successful comedy you can always look a little bit deeper and see that there's something else going on aside from it just being a comedy. Like even Dodgeball, the underdog story. That's just about a guy who's decided instead of living passively, he's going to live actively. That's basically the thematic message
But
of that
you know
film.
what? The beats and the idea and the thing that there's still a story there. At the end, there's a competition. They have to win it.
Hmm.
There's stakes. Even if you remove the comedic performances and the comedy, and you just looked at it as a story that's unfolding, I think that there's still a structure of a story. Yes, there's bonkers stuff that happens. Patches O'Houlihan and Ben Stiller as the global Jim or whatever. I mean, there's
Hmm.
stuff that's like off the wall, but those characters still make sense within a story structure.
Yes, they do, and I think that's what the script needs with regards to a rewrite. I mean, again, the premise is prime for good comedy. I'd be hard pressed to actually find actors today that could probably do it well, but they might be out there that we just haven't met yet. And if you can really hone down and focus on the characters and focus on what each one is trying to achieve and make that clear and have fun with the actual conflict that's not aping other films, I think this could be a really good movie. But in this current form, this is a hard pass for me. I can't. I basically would have to send it back with a polite rejection letter saying your idea is solid, your execution is very flaccid. Go back to the drawing board, get this in proper shape. This is what you need to do. Give me stakes for Han, give me stakes for Charles. Establish their relationship um, as a character quickly, but let us know who these two individuals are first, and keep it into the proper Abbott and Costello, Felix and Oscar relationship, where the straight man of the two is the one that we are behind, and we are discovering the eccentric clown that is Hans Christian Andersen as the story goes on, and because right now the current method is just it's not there. I basically have to say the thumbnail to this stream is a million times funnier than the movie script itself. Just the
You're
visual
probably right.
alone.
Yes, I agree with you. And I mean, maybe in the hands of somebody else, this could have been better. I agree that maybe the guy just isn't a good fit. And I also agree with what you said that I don't know how this is in the top 30. Maybe they like the premise or the idea, but there's no way that this screenplay is in the top 30
No, I think it has to
of
do with the
anything.
fact that maybe a lot of a lot of producers are desperate for a comedy that they're giving it a little bit benefit of the doubt just because we haven't had many really shine.
Right.
And I can see some producers reading this and laughing. They don't have much taste, but I can see them doing that. So yeah, I mean, I will say this: congrats to the writer for getting into the top 30 on the blacklist. It's, I'm gonna say, is more luck than it was skill. Not to be insulting, but I think you have the skill in the premise, just not on the page with the execution.
Yes.
But if you can get yourself into that mindset where you came up with the premise and drive that home, and I think that this could be a very good comedy, a much needed comedy. But unfortunately, you got to throw out a lot of the stuff in this script that just does not work because you haven't earned through the characters permission to get away with these gags. So those are my thoughts there.
Maybe like Ricky Gervais could have played Charles Dickens, and I'm trying to think who you'd bring for that Danish guy. Something that's more like dry humor. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Man, it's hard to think of at this point because we're in a drought of good comedic actors.
Yeah,
And
it's
performers.
true. There's really nothing to work with. I mean, who would even play the Hans one?
I don't know, because like I mean, even like most weekdays, me and my girlfriend, we go, like, usually beginning of the week and sometimes on weekends. We usually go down to Toronto and go to the stand-up clubs. And why? It's number one, it's pretty affordable, and number two, you never know, you might find someone that's very, very funny. And much like the aggregate when it comes to screenplays and movies, there's more bad than there is good. But when there's good, you're really excited and you're happy to see them. This past year alone, I could think maybe out of the nearly 4 dozen shows we've gone to, maybe 2 comics were any good, and the rest were kind of not terrible, but nothing to share with others, saying you got to go see this person's show.
Maybe Robert Downey Jr. could have played like Hans Christian Andersen. I don't know. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe he would have been.
I think probably be better as Charles Dickens.
Right, he'd be Charles Dickens, and then I don't think Ricky Gervais would be a good Hans, though. I would need somebody else as Hans Christian Andersen.
Yeah, gosh, I'm struggling to think who could do that.
Matt Smith.
He's a giant compared to Hardy J. That'd be.
Even so, I mean, I think Matt Smith has this kind of douchey vibe that he could bring to the table if he wanted, and there could be something funny there if necessary.
No, I don't disagree with that. I think that's
Or
possible.
if you want, maybe like a Christian Bale could play Dickens, and then Matt Smith would play Hans Christian Andersen. But again, really written thoughtfully, with humor that's dry, but performances that are nuanced enough to bring a little bit of those chuckles, but also make it a intriguing movie with some heart.
Yeah, I mean I mean that's why screenwriting is so difficult. You can't just rely on the one gimmick of like, oh, it's got lots of action, oh, it's got lots of drama, oh, it's got lots of sex, oh, it's got lots of gags. It's like none of that means anything if you don't have really strong characters. And yeah, this script unfortunately is for 2 historical figures that has a great deal written about them. It should have been, like shooting fish in a barrel to write them as an odd couple together.
Right.
So.
Oh well.
Oh, I mean, yeah.
Better luck next time, whoever this author is.
Yes.
Maybe next time something good will happen.
Well, yeah, Henry Thaler, if you're listening to this, try again on that part. Like, you don't have to necessarily rewrite the script, but maybe you won't listen to us because you said, "Oh yeah, I made the blacklist. What the heck did you guys do?" Well, I mean, I'm not going to dox myself for you, but I will say, you if you want to take this all the way, and I think you should give it a shot. put in a readjust your focus to more of these characters and who they were, and let your comedic instincts react to that discovery of who these characters were, as opposed to trying to do the opposite, which is leading with your comic gags and trying to make the characters fit into them. That's my advice.
Also, regardless of doxing, the fact that whether you're on a list or not a list, it doesn't mean that you can't evaluate a screenplay. I personally haven't submitted a screenplay to be on that list, so it's not there. If I did, would it end up on the list? It's probably very difficult to end up on that list. But I will say that a lot of times it's not necessarily the most talented people that arrive on those type of lists. It's just people that maybe have the right connections or whatever it is. So I kind of take all of that with a grain of salt. But I'll give you a final example that, let's say you take Taylor Swift and you say, she sold a lot of albums. She sold a lot of, you give me a song of hers and you say, look at this song. A million people or 100 million people listen to it. That doesn't mean that I can't write a song that's better than that. I will even tell you that I believe I can write songs a lot of times that are better than that. But at the end of the day, I'm not a younger lady, blonde lady that the little girls like. Sometimes you need the right circumstances around you. I guess what I'm saying is that him being on this list doesn't mean that nobody can criticize the screenplay. The screenplay is just not very good.
Yeah, I think, and you know what? I think that's a good learning lesson for him and for everyone out there. I think, yeah, there's nothing much I can add to that. That was really well put, Price. Thank you.
I did my best, but you understand what I'm trying to say. It's not.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter that. Listen, the general, whether it's another screenwriter or a random person, the audience is entitled to their opinion, and they can judge the quality as whether or not they're invested into it. And there's nothing wrong with that. And it's, I mean, as long as they're giving you something of substance in that criticism, it becomes valid. Like, just saying it's crap is not really helpful to anybody, because it's like, well, it's a very broad term. How do I take that and learn from it, right?
No, we were very,
but we've gone through.
Yeah, we were very thorough in explaining what was wrong with it, and I think we did a pretty decent job.
Yes, that's where I like the idea. It's like, oh, if someone says, oh, I didn't like this because I didn't get a sense of who this character was, even though I see these points being made, it didn't feel like it was strong enough for me to buy into. This is going to be the consistency and line up with the tone of the screenplay. That is something that a writer can work with. Oh, I see. We got a disconnect between the tone that I'm setting up and the characters, or the characters I'm setting up and these different types of tones that are coming into, where we have the eccentric humor, we have the innuendo humor, we then have the weird fairy tale fantasy thing going on with delusions and hallucination stuff. It's all over the board. So figuring out a way to focus that, or figuring out a way where you can better segue into those variations of tone without it feeling like it's a hard turn in a different direction, would definitely benefit, what the writer is trying to go for.
For sure.
All right. Well, you know what? With that, let's call it a night. Price, thank you so much for joining me this week. Please share with everyone listening where they can find you. On the
I have
interweb.
the channel Price of Reason. That's my main channel, where I have movie reviews and some news reporting. And then I have Price of Reason Live, which there we have our weekly stream that you're on also, that we watch Quantum Leap episodes and analyze them. And at the same time, I also have other live streams there, which are also worth checking out. So it's sort of my regular channel and my live channel.
Yes, go check that out. I want to thank Darren M. for putting the links in the chat for that. For now, guys, I want to wish you all a happy weekend. Enjoy Saturday the 14th, and hopefully you've recovered from any upsets that have happened on Friday the 13th. And if none have happened, thank the good Yoda for protecting you over on that superstition. Have a great time. I can't wait to see you guys all next week. And never forget, when it comes to great story, it all starts with the script.